Answer: superior science and technology. And today, again, in one of the most remarkable shifts that is happening, this mastery of science and technology is shifting to Asia. Indeed, when I was writing my book, I was doing some research. I came across a Time magazine cover story called Asia's Great Science Experiment, and in which they quoted a late Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Richard Smalley, who said, this is a few years ago, he said, by 2010, 90% of all the PhD graduates in the world will be Asian. Maybe it's not 90%, maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 70%, but it's a remarkable shift. And you get anecdotal evidence of this everywhere. In fact, Tom Friedman wrote a column in the New York Times where he said that he went for a graduation ceremony at a very famous American institute, Rensselaer Institute of Technology. And he said when the names of the graduates were being read out for the PhD graduates, he said the names began with Tan, Lee, Wang, Kumar, Kapoor, Rakesh. And he said, finally, one David Morrow saved the day. One Anglo-Saxon name in the list of all the PhD graduates. And believe me, this shift in mastery of science and technology is again happening at an incredible rate. And in the year 2008, for the first time, Europe spent $250 billion in R&D, in science and technology. North America spent $384 billion, and East Asia spent $387 billion, exceeding North America and Europe for the first time, and growing. Now I can give you statistic after statistic, but it's always a little human story that drives it home. I can tell you, for me, it happened when the provost of Harvard University came to Singapore. And my counterpart, the dean of the Kennedy School, said, Kishore, would you mind receiving the provost of Harvard? I said, of course. So when the provost came to my office, I sat down, I spoke to him. I said, why are you, the provost of Harvard University, coming to Asia? Because you can sit in your office and kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers all go to Harvard. Why are you traveling? And his answer was, well, he said, we in Harvard too can see what is happening. I said, what do you see happening? He says, R&D in science and technology is shifting to Asia, and we want to see what's happening. So when the provost of Harvard University stands up and takes note, you realize the world has changed. And what's the third pillar of Western wisdom? I'm going to go a bit faster because of the time. Third one is what I call a culture of pragmatism. And what do I mean by the culture of pragmatism? Well, the best definition of pragmatism was the one given by the great Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. And you know what he said? He said, it does not matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. Very simple. But you know what that means? He says it doesn't matter whether it is communism or it's capitalism. If it delivers result, let's work with it. And that's how Deng Xiaoping justified switching the economic system of China towards capitalism. But Deng Xiaoping was not the first Asian pragmatist. The first Asian pragmatists were the Japanese. And that's why, as you know, Japan was the first Asian country to modernize. And so, in the 1860s, in the Meiji Reformation, when the Japanese saw how India, a country of 300 million people, had been colonized by 100,000 Englishmen, and they saw how China, a large country, been humiliated by the Western powers in the Opium War and so on and so forth, the Japanese said, we are next. So the Japanese decided to change. So they sent young Japanese out, they went to America, they went to Europe, they studied the best practices, and they copied. So they copied American free market economics, the German army, the British Navy, the French Napoleonic Code, copied, and they succeeded. So what's happening in Asia today is essentially the success of one Asian country has led to other countries copying from them. So Japan went first, then came the Four Tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, then the ASEAN countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, then of course China. When Deng Xiaoping came to Southeast Asia in 1978, he was shocked to find that the Southeast Asian capitals were ahead of Chinese cities. He said China must change. And after China changed, India said, we too must change. And therefore you have this incredible sweep of modernity that is sweeping across Asia, beginning with Japan and keeps marching on. And this culture of pragmatism is a culture of learning from one another that is growing very rapidly in Asia. The fourth pillar of Western wisdom I describe as meritocracy. How do I explain meritocracy? I find the best way to explain meritocracy is to use the example of Brazil. And I often ask myself the obvious question. Why is Brazil consistently a soccer superpower? Always in the World Cup finals or winning the World Cup, always. But not yet, maybe next year, but not yet, an economic superpower. Why not? And the answer, quite simply, is that when it comes to looking for football talent, Brazil goes to the upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and it even goes into the slums, into the favelas. And if it finds a young boy who can kick the ball well, they say, come, young man, come and play for Brazil. So they look for talent among 200 million Brazilians. But when it comes to looking for economic talent, they look for it in the upper class, upper middle class, maybe lower middle class. But they don't go into the slums and say, come and be an economic superstar for Brazil. And with that example, if you want to understand why Asia is returning, the answer is amazingly simple. And what's the simple answer? Asia always had the largest pool of brains in the world. But Asia always had also the largest pool of unused brains in the world. And now the unused brains are being used. And that's why this tremendous explosion in Asia. Let me illustrate this point with one simple story. For thousands of years, in a country like India, where my ancestors came from, your birth was your destiny. And if you were born at the very bottom in India, and the very bottom in India is much worse off than the very bottom in any other part of the world, because if you were born an untouchable, the lowest caste, people couldn't touch you. So you were born an untouchable, you lived an untouchable, and you died an untouchable. You could never escape the destiny of your birth.